Bonsoir tout le monde. Hello, I'm Marie Dorini. I'm the Associate Director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to the Fellows Talk, the SNF Rendez-Vous de l'Institut. I'm very happy to be introducing Barry Bergdoll, Meyer Shapiro Professor of Art History in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and a grand habitué of Reed Hall, if there ever was one. You've been coming?
50 years. Okay, almost.
49 years. So in addition to that and to his position at Columbia, Barry was Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at MoMA from 2007 to 2013, and he served since 2018 as president of the board of the Center for Architecture in New York City. He's been a member of the Pritzker Prize architecture jury since 2019. An expert in modern architectural history, Barry has written extensively on Henri Labrouste, Viollet-le-Duc, Frank Lloyd Wright, the Bauhaus, and Le Corbusier, to name a few. We owe him many major architectural exhibitions. He was the curator of Mies in Berlin, shown in New York, Barcelona, and Berlin from 2001 to 2003. Le Panthéon, symbole des révolutions, shown in Montreal and Paris in 1989. And Les Vaudoyers, une dynastie d'architectes at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris in 1992, also to name a few. Otherwise, I'll be standing here all night, and we'd like to listen to Barry. So the idea for Barry's book project, Out of Sight in Plain View, grew from the Mellon lectures that Barry delivered at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 2013. He explores the origins of the modern architectural exhibition beginning in the 18th century and the paradox of exhibiting representations of buildings rather than buildings themselves. Of course, the fellows in Barry's cohort have been lucky enough in recent weeks to explore real buildings in Paris with Barry as a guide. And while we're getting used to this exceptional treatment, we're all delighted to be sitting here for a change and listen to you talk about representations tonight. Thank you, Barry.
Un grand merci. Thank you so much to Marie, to James, to Justine, to Brune, my old friend who's here. It's always wonderful. I feel so at home at Reed Hall. I can't believe that I will have to leave. But I won't take too much time with all the thanks I'd like to make because my talk is a little long. So I hope you'll be patient with me. At a certain point, I will move into speed mode because I was in a great dilemma whether I would give you an overview of the book that I'm writing or whether I would give you a segment of it. And in the end, I decided to go for the overview. And at a certain point, I might fly over part of the overview if I sense that the time is going too long. There's an epilogue to this talk because I've been invited to speak down the street at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in a couple of weeks. So the manifesto that comes at the end of this, I'm going to add water and powder to it, and it'll be a full-blown manifesto there if anyone would like to come. So Out of Sight in Plain View needs a little bit of explication because, in fact, it is at the heart of this project, which is to write a very long history of an extremely paradoxical activity, the idea of exhibiting architecture. We can ask, and we will again in a few slides, why exhibit architecture? Isn't it already on exhibition? What does it mean to exhibit architecture? You're also going to hear that most people who have worked on this subject, and they're an increasing number, worry about the fact that you can only show representations of architecture, and therefore the exhibition is a poor reflection of the very art of architecture. I decided when I gave the lectures at the National Gallery a number of years ago that were referred to that it was going to be my job to turn that around and say, if there's an over 250-year history of this activity, what does it provide for the culture of architecture that's positive? And so the chapters I'm going to take you through, each one conjugates, if you will, the question, what has the activity of exhibiting added to the larger culture of architecture, and how can we account for that? And the dynamic is going to play out in this play on words, out of sight. You have to see it to understand it, out of sight, in plain view, which has to do with the dynamic of decontextualizing and recontextualizing, or if you will, in the violent image, which will be explained to you in the course of the lecture on the right. Of course, all represented, recognize the building site of the Museum of Modern Art here with the Japanese house on it, radically decontextualized. The violent image from the French Revolution will also have to do with another way of conjugating that theme, if you will, and that is in the redefinition of the object of architecture once it is put into the mode of display, but not simply display, of exhibition, meaning that it is combined with other objects to create some kind of discourse narrative or not. As was mentioned, my own training as a historian is as much through the activity of exhibiting it as it is through the media that most academics work in, which is writing. So as much as writing books, I've been concerned with creating exhibitions, exploring ideas through exhibitions, and some of my fellows know that one of them, which continues to fascinate me, was an exhibition done in 1989 on the French Pantheon, in which we traced in the galleries, first in Paris and then at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, the life history of a building, suggesting that not only its genesis, but its subsequent life. And we traced that from what I called the first, la première pierre jusqu'à la dernière rose, if you will, from the laying of the cornerstone until Mitterrand's televised carrying of a single rose, which mysteriously managed to place on several graves inside the Pantheon. But were we to update it, I think we would have to take into account President Macron and his current fascination with the Pantheon, which has led to these extraordinary permanent installations by Anselm Kiefer. But that's not my topic. I came of age as well, I would say, in the age of postmodernism, which was an age not only where history took on new and challenging meanings, but it took on new public dimensions and an absolute flurry of new creations of museums. On the top left, you see the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, where the 1989 exhibition that I did was one of the opening exhibitions, but also others, including the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine here in Paris, opened in 2007, probably at the end of that great postmodern creation of about 25 new museums of architecture around the world. So despite the paradoxical difficulty of exhibiting architecture, the institutions in which it takes place have continued to proliferate, including, in a way, the grandmother of all of them, MoMA, which opened in 1929 and had a Department of Architecture from 1932. So it is the oldest sustained Department of Architecture anywhere in the world, although, dare we mention, Russia, later in that same year, the Shushev Museum of Architecture opened in Moscow. But you might ask, and we can again take 1989 as a date, 1989 now not as the bicentennial of the French Revolution or my first foray into exhibiting architecture, but 1989 as the date of the public unveiling of the internet. So as you get bored with my lecture, you could visit past or future lectures, versions of the Venice Architectural Biennale without any fear of climate change or rising sea levels on your iPhone. So why go to a museum at all today? Why even be concerned with the history of exhibiting architecture, or for that matter, since I'm currently involved in curating some upcoming exhibitions, making new ones? This was a question I was asking in 2007 when I went for a decade to work at the Museum of Modern Art, but the photograph that I took that morning upon arrival said to me, why bother to ask the question? Museums are crowded beyond belief. For some reason, there are still reasons that people want to go to museums. So let's go into the heart of the topic, and I will linger a little bit on the first two chapters of the book, which are very French-oriented and 18th and 19th century oriented, and then I'll give you a suggestion of what other possibilities I believe have been created over time for the paradoxical activity of architecture, with this idea of decontextualization, recontextualization, or deracinating and reintegrating. So the first slide, of course, evokes what I've already said. Why bother to exhibit architecture? Isn't it always, even with 1970s mirror glass, always already on display once it is built? Of course, there are things other than the completed building, which we will see in the course of the hour. But still, one might say, why exhibit architecture? Partly already this dreadful mirror-faced building in Buenos Aires suggests that perhaps you look at the building across the street with a little less of a level of distraction when it is given to you in reflection and you stop and look at it. So, to evoke in a certain sense Walter Benjamin, I'm interested in stopping that moment of, or creating that moment of distraction, that one might see a building differently. But how would one go about taking the building into the gallery, into the museum, into the various institutions which from the 18th century have begun to admit the public rather than, let's say, princes or ecclesiastical figures into places where art and potentially architecture might be put on display. How might we exhibit architecture? How is it going to be possible to bring it into the museum? There are some extreme examples where we take the museum out into the world. The display case, one of the great apparatuses of the museum here, taken out to the level of a building. This is an important historical monument in the history of Argentina, the house of the first president of the Argentine Republic, Sarmiento, which has been preserved in recent years by creating one of the world's largest museum cases around it. So here we have the building as museum object. We might also take that other great apparatus of the museum out of doors, and that is the label, the wall label, the text label, all of the things that we fight over as curators when we work in museums. So I'm just giving you one example. Here is the Center for Cultural Development in a poor district of Medellin in Colombia. It's the last posthumous work by that great Colombian disciple of Le Corbusier, Rogelio Salmona. And for the visitors from this largely illiterate neighborhood, when they come here, but they can borrow books and television programs and go to activities. But as they wander through, the staff was not content to simply let them encounter the architecture. The building narrates itself as though it's itself on display. So this patio, we're told, is an example of mirrors of water, and we're told about their heritage in Hispanic architecture, or we're meant to slow down for Kodak moment when we learn that ramps are in order to enjoy time. Or as we wander around the cities, whether it be Paris or New York, we're often invited by museum labels from preservation groups that have tried to museify our cities, that we might become more cognizant or enter that state of, or leave that state of distraction to at least encounter an attraction. So the problem, let's go back to the origins, which I'm going to take to the middle of the 18th century. Of course, it is a period of the emergence of the Public Art Museum, but how will architecture enter into that museum? Two paintings that represent architecture entering in a very grandiose way, but entering through the medium of painting, whether it be through this imaginary gallery painted in Rome in the 1750s, or Hubert Robert in a painted version of his proposal for the transformation of the Grand Galerie at the Louvre, that you all know, from a palatial space into a space for the Louvre as museum, through skylighting, which he's proposing. He's not only proposing skylighting, he's also proposing that perhaps there could be a museum of antiquity with a demonstration of all of the architectural wonders, particularly of ancient Rome. You almost might have noticed as well that he's proposing the origins of the one-man show, since every painting on display is to be painted by Hubert Robert. But therefore we can see that only through representation initially is architecture going to enter into the gallery. So the first chapter of the book, don't worry, even though there are 10, we're not going to be here for 10 hours, is called Framed and Hung, Architecture in Public, from the Salon to the French Revolution. It was the emergence of the French Salon in the mid-18th century, quickly followed by the summer exhibition of the Royal Academy in London, and then exhibitions by the end of the century in most major European cities, that raised the question, might architecture go out into public display, different from the place where it has either been built or projected, to join painting and sculpture in an encounter with the public. Now, admittedly, probably at least since the invention of paper and the gradual separation of the architectural profession from the building trades through the act of drawing and projecting the future in a set of construction documents, more and more beautiful, and in particular, the creation of the academic system of education through competitions on projected buildings realized through drawings. At least since that invention of paper, I think architects put drawings up on the wall and discuss them among themselves. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the moment when the non-professional, the public, is admitted, because chapter 1, Framed and Hung, makes the argument that the public exhibition of architecture makes possible the public debate of architecture. So it changes who is the public for architecture, and it enters architecture into the debate on the public debate, which is itself a major topic of rising criticism, of coffeehouse culture, and of the salon in the 18th century. This is an example from the Roman Accademia di San Luca by the architect Filippo Iovara, we can move to these engravings from the 19th century, late 19th century, which represent the practice at the École des Beaux-Arts, the students rushing in their chariot, the charrette, that still counts for last-minute work, to register them in the Salle Melpomene. If any of you go see my colleague Diane Baudard's wonderful exhibition at the École des Beaux-Arts, you will be in the Salle Melpomene, where the drawings were hung up. But most important is this engraving, because the judgment of the Grand Prix competition is taking place, and you'll notice that there's no one there under 65 years old. So the students are not present during this judgment. Later, it's opened up to a short public display. What I'm interested in is when the public is allowed into the pinup and the display is actually encouraging the public. Some years ago, I gave this lecture, and this slide was not part of it, in Canada, and I maintained that the public exhibition began in the 1760s in Paris and in Rome, when the public could see and make comments, and even art critics began to comment on architectural matters and display, and there was a protest that this extremely well-documented exhibition, except that we have, as usual, no view of the exhibition itself, which were the competitive projects for adding this chapel in 1709 to the Gesù, the prime church of the Jesuits, in Rome, had led to a public exhibition. This is true. The Jesuits put on display the various projects, and the public began to race to see this exhibition, and there are even accounts of the number of people, rather extraordinarily high for an architectural exhibition, that went to see it. But the document that we have is a record of all the comments, particularly negative comments, that were overheard in the public, in order that the Jesuits could come up with a strategy to suppress dissent. So I am interested in exactly the opposite. And the key moment for me is going to come in 1767, when in Dublin, the competition for the new Royal Exchange, later to be the City Hall, the exhibition of the possible entries. You see the winning entry as realized on the top, and two runners-up were put on display for public viewing, but also public commentary before the judgment. There was an enormous amount of discussion of it in the press in then British Ireland, and interestingly enough as well, part of the brief for this Royal Exchange involved the creation of a coffee room on the upper floor where the public would be able to read journals and everything that the historian many years ago, Jürgen Habermas, referred to as the structural transformation of the public sphere. So not only was this a public exhibition that welcomed and allowed public debate on the creation of the most important public building in Dublin in the 1760s, but the building itself was going to encourage ongoing public discussion. Now, in the Parisian Salon, initially there was a limitation, as only members of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture were allowed to exhibit. But there are two architects in particular who were simultaneously members of the Academy of Architecture and painted. We have the famous example of Charles-Louis Clarisseau, who exhibited over and over again in the Parisian Salon, later even during stays in London, in display venues in London, but primarily his renderings of classical buildings, either topographical or even extended imaginary in their rendering. They were largely extremely well received, although Horace Walpole, for instance, noted of one in London that it was so theatrical it looked more like scene painting than architecture. But what interests me most, and here is a figure who will loom large for the next few minutes, is when architects begin to display, as they had in Ireland, projections of the future, buildings that do not yet exist. So buildings on which the public might not be simply refining their taste, but might have an absolute interest in the way they will change public life and the public scene. One of the earliest is de Vailly with his associate Marie-Joseph Père, displaying what you know now as the Odeon, drawings for, once again, a highly public building, the Théâtre on the left bank, being developed with a whole urban quarter. One thing I think you can see immediately of interest here is how being admitted to compete with paintings and sculptures on the wall, architectural drawing itself changes from a technical nature to a highly pictorial one, in which, here at least in the lower scene, de Vailly seems to have imagined as though the actors, perhaps in Racine's Phèdre or some other antique play, have left the stage and are occupying the stage of public life on the staircase. But so the creation of this enormous stage for the enacting of going to the theater as a place of public assembly, is also being put avant la lettre, before even being built, on public display at the Salon for commentary. And indeed, the creation of incredibly fascinating and amazingly evocative new types of drawings, this cutaway section in which all of the activities of both the interval, you see people at the intermission, even out on a portico overlooking the urban amphitheater that Devailly also created, but we see the play on stage, people moving and acting through the building. So the entire animation of the scene, by taking over many elements from the period's history painting into the representation of architecture, that it might not address simply a client or the person who needs to build the building, but also a public, both to appreciate and to debate it. And here I want to thank my friend Mark Deming, who's in the audience, for having pointed out to me that in this, this work exhibited in 1789, which imagines a revision of the space of the Salon in the great Salon Carré of the Louvre, with the addition of a mezzanine so that this floor-to-ceiling type of arrangement could be appreciated by a greater number of people. This animated scene for if you will, a remodeling of the Louvre itself. Devailly has included an exhibition of his own work in the lower left. And in fact, we know from the historian Michel Gallet some years ago that at one point at the Salon, Devailly had even set up a stand that he might listen behind, or a kind of curtain that he might listen behind to hear the comments that were made about his work. Now, how many there were and how helpful they might have been, we don't know. Because throughout the 19th century, commentaries on the Salon will say, if you want to be at peace, head immediately to the architecture gallery. There's no one. There's quiet. So it was always an uphill battle, even once a place had been gained inside the public display of the Salon. And ambitions got larger and larger. Here's Devailly imagining on one sheet of paper a whole series of interventions in the city of Paris that might, in fact, lead to greater public salubrity, greater circulation, a proposal for a complete renovation of the city. So here a prototype, in fact, of the exhibition as a place for debating not simply the individual building, but the shape of the city, urban reform as a whole. This was by no means confined, but just to show you a few examples before I give you some sense of the next thing that is created for architecture through the paradoxical activity of exhibition. Just to jump across the channel for a moment. John Soane, architect of the Bank of England and many other important projects from the 1780s into the 1820s, later professor at the Royal Academy of Architecture, frequent exhibitor at the summer exhibitions of the Royal Academy, not every single one, but very, very frequently, is perhaps the first to employ a professional renderer. So we might say the new profession of rendering for another architect. These are not drawings by Soane, but by Joseph Gandy, his renderer. He's showing you a top secret place, the Bank of England, which only dignitaries on voyage were allowed to visit during the many decades it was a work site from the 1790s into the 18-teens. There was also a rule at the Royal Academy that you were only allowed to exhibit one work. This was a problem for architects, of course. To understand a building, you need to see its plan, its section, its elevation, a variety of views that will make clear the spatial conception, besides the fact that people were not allowed inside the complex spaces of much of the Bank of England. So the famous rendering below where, and there's been much debate among historians whether this is to be interpreted as the Bank of England in bird's eye view under construction or in a future ruin of the British economy. This is a sort of pre-Brexit vision. Is also responds to the fact that Soane can only send one view a year of the Bank of England to the Royal Academy. So these are from two separate years. Now, a really great threshold moment for us, very, very important, not only because, as far as I know, it is the first exhibition to be accompanied by an exhibition catalog, were the competitions that were organized in the year 1794 for you laity, who are not aware of the beginning of time with the French Revolution. And in that year, painters, sculptors, architects were all invited to respond to patriotic and revolutionary briefs for the iconography of a new society, of a tumultuous new vision of a form of government, including several score building projects. So this is a project for a temple décadaire, which would not be translated as a decadent temple, as in some English language books, but rather as a temple to celebrate the décade, the 10th day holiday of the new calendar of the revolutionary period. And you see not only a vision of a completely new symbolic architecture, stripped in many ways of the familiar language of the classical language of architecture, but also a vision of how architects might give form to all of the building types required for a new society. So here are just some of the examples. There are about 80 different projects involved. Percier Fontaine, an altar to the heroes of the fatherland, a project for a local assembly hall, which has elements of the Constitution, probably without its current controversial clause, inscribed on the facade for an increasingly literary public. And this spurs a whole series of entries into both Parisian and provincial displays of projects for the complete transformation of public space. Probably the most spectacular, this by the architect François Verly, for the transformation of the center of Lille, exhibited in 1796 to 97. This inspired in the very same year the commissioning of projects, competitive projects, for a monument to Frederick the Great. I think that the Prussians were very worried about what had happened on the Place, now the Place de la Concorde, once the guillotine had gone up, and they decided to celebrate a royal hero and his beneficence in creating a tomb for Frederick the Great on the great entry square of Leipziger Platz in Berlin. And the different projects were put on exhibit, including this spectacular watercolor by the 25-year-old Friedrich Gilli, who became almost overnight a famous figure. So the idea, too, that the exhibition might lead to fame and a reputation through public display, even for someone who had only built a few private commissions by that point. People began to talk in the press not only of what this would do for Berlin and was this the way to go, an enormous press commentary that emerged, so that connects to my theme as well, that public discourse is connected. A very young man named Schinkel left school for the day to go see the exhibition and decided when he saw this drawing he wanted to be an architect. So there's the power of the exhibition. But most particularly, people began to speak of the assembly of drawings that were in that exhibition as the recognition of a Berlin school. So the idea that there might be a school or a group is also established by the architectural display. Just two more examples from the emergence of the public debate that I see as the first sort of positive that is given to architecture by this paradoxical notion of exhibition. Here on the screen, of course, the British Houses of Parliament. But I would say that each theme that I introduced in the book continues to the present. So we might say that the panoply or the arsenal of tools that are given to the architectural curator or the institutions of exhibition never cede. In fact, they simply are augmented as new possibilities emerge. So, of course, the Houses of Parliament was put up for a public competition after it burned in 1834. A new Palace of Westminster was required. It was decided that for a parliamentary system there should be a public competition, so there were scores and scores of entries. And then there was a public outcry that these were being held in closed chambers for judgment, and essentially a public competition was forced. Interestingly, it was held in the not yet complete building of William Wilkins's new National Gallery on Trafalgar Square. So amazingly, though there have not been many since, the first ever exhibition in the British National Gallery was an architectural exhibition, and the press coverage and debate continued throughout the period of construction of the building into the 1850s. To take up to something that many of us have experienced, the forcing of the decision about what to do with Ground Zero after 9/11 into a public competition, invited public competition, but also into a public display, was a later day replay of precisely that demand that the exhibition be the venue for bringing important decisions about the public realm in architecture into the realm of public viewing and of public debate. Chapter 2, it's going to get shorter with each chapter, so stay reassured. Chapter 2 is called In and Out of Time, And for the handful of architectural historian friends in the room, this posits the notion that our very discipline of architectural history depended on the invention of the architectural display and the positing of a possibility of an architectural museum, because inconveniently, buildings are not built in chronological order down the street. So one can't read the history of architecture by simply moving through space. One needs to decontextualize, recontextualize into emerging notions of historical development, of the history of style and the like. Of course, this is going to see a flourishing during the French Revolution, when, as you can see here, we have a very lively public debate on the meaning of memorials, of works of architecture and sculpture that might be seen at Saint-Denis. We'll return to that in just a second. Of course, the French Revolution had set out not only to restart and reinvent time, the revolutionary calendar that I've already referred to, the creation of the département, here the notion that France, where Cartesian thinking was invented, might submit itself to Cartesian graph planning. Didn't quite work out that way. But most importantly for us, for this idea of decontextualization, recontextualization, the museographing, if you will, the moving into the museum space of works from different realms. So here we have two activities of the extraordinary figure Alexandre Lenoir during the Revolution, and two words that were coined among scores and scores of others during the French Revolutionary decade. The first is vandalisme, meaning the attack on a work of art, and this is Lenoir at Saint-Denis, trying to convince the sans-culottes that the tombs of the kings and queens of France are not symbols of royal oppression, but are in fact works of the genius of French artistry. So this transformation of these objects into historical works of the nation, as opposed to personal marks of royalty. On the right, we see the same Alexandre Lenoir in a quieter moment, setting up what I'll see on the next slide, his museum of French monuments, in which many displaced works of sculpture and even architectural fragments would be put on chronological display, inventing the new role for himself as conservateur, or keeper, that person who's now trying to preciously protect, but also display and recontextualize in his transformation of the monastery of the Petits Augustins into a chronological sequence of rooms with the Hall of the 12th and the 13th century, creating, in a certain sense, the forerunner of the period room, by assembling things that had never been in one place together into an image, a highly coloristic, highly effective, highly popular instantiation of a vision of history told through works of art, sculptural and architectural fragments. If that museum no longer exists, but it was in fact in the same convent, same monastery, which is today houses in part the École des Beaux-Arts. So if you wander to the end of the Rue Bonaparte, you will see the largest scale parts which could not fully be returned. The Renaissance, on the far right, the Renaissance portico of the Chateau of Annette, still standing there. The Arc of Gaillon from the Norman Chateau of Gaillon. This, in his vision, were different moments from the evolution of French architecture. And the architect who transformed the place into the École des Beaux-Arts, Félix Dubon, insisted in a very controversial debate that these elements should remain, because he wanted the School of Architecture to represent a historical lesson of the way forms in architecture had evolved over the great history of civilization, a kind of counter to the idea that there was one ideal beauty in a timeless classicism. And therefore the students would progress past the Gothic age, through the Renaissance, ultimately into the Palace of Studies to see this great display of casts. So the idea that artistic education itself should take place in relationship to the ability to experience through physical objects a chronological evolution and understand not only the shape of the past, but the trajectories that it traced into the future, were key to all of 19th century architectural education. But of course the public interests me as much. And this largely took place through the incredible bonanza of the creation of models of historic architecture that they might enter into the nascent idea by the end of the 19th century of a museum of architecture. The key medium was cork, so light that it could be carried. There's a wonderful catalog about collections in Germany called Carrying Rome Over the Alps. into the princely collections of these cork models of the Colosseum, the Temple of the Sibyl, temples at Paestum. The trade had emerged once English tourists in Naples went into shops that sold Christmas creches and said, we don't want all the religious figures, we just need the classical temple, please. And in Naples, they realized that there was, in fact, a business for what they thought of as staffage for tourists and for feeding originally cabinets of curiosities. Here you see an ad for all of the types you might have, and some of the picturesque displays. What really interests me is the moment when they start to take on a historical chronological display. Probably the earliest was Dubourg's Museum in London, one of the so-called shows of London. This is his advertisement. You can see cork models of ancient temples, etc. It existed into the 1820s when, unfortunately, at one moment, the operable model of Vesuvius exploded during a demonstration and caught fire, burning the whole museum down. However, a much more serious example, and one that influenced at least a short generation of students and painters in Paris, was the painter Louis Casas's display of cork, porcelain, and other models in a chronological sequence, 3 parallel chronological sequences related to a very complex notion of parallel trains of historical development. This he opened in the bottom of the Rue de Seine, hoping that the École des Beaux-Arts would purchase the whole for him as part of what became De Rigueur in the 19th and early 20th century, which is a gallery of historical examples. Here's the gallery in the École des Ponts et Chaussées of engineering examples. Likewise, we have as much in this chapter in which it becomes possible through recontextualization to trace history, instrumentalizations of the history of ornament. This is the short-lived Architectural Museum in London, which also raises the sub-theme of who is the audience. Not only students, but of course the public, but also workmen who will be involved, artisans who will be involved in creating historical ornament for the revivalist buildings that are at the center of the stylistic debates of the 19th century. And so the great plaster model displays, whether they be the 2 still surviving ones, the Victoria and Albert Museum, or these full-scale plaster models. This is the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. This is the Metropolitan Museum in 1912. That was all sold at auction some decades later. Nearly every museum in the world had architectural representations in their cast displays. But what interests me is not so much collecting them, but putting them into narrative sequences. The history of a place that you might know, the Trocadero, which began life after it was built for the 1878 World's Fair as the Museum of Comparative Sculpture, an idea of Viollet-le-Duc's, opened in 1882. Viollet-le-Duc imagined originally that a display at 1-to-1 scale of casts of French cathedral portals and elements of French cathedrals put into a full display of the stylistic arc of the Middle Ages would be played against ancient sculptures. This is not frequently noted that there are, in fact, a subcategory of the evolution of Greek art, because he saw the history of art as a cyclical process, and those cycles could be put into comparative a display next to one another. These were all removed some time later to create a display, of which remnants are still in the building, of the gloriful march of French Gothic architecture as the very symbol of French artistic genius. Now, the third chapter, you'll see this is getting faster and faster as we move through these chapters, is called Not at Home. In fact, those of us here in the Institute are very happy not to be at home, but I'm interested in not at home. So I'm calling it here, Architecture Exported and Reimported, and the Debate on Identity. The debate on national identity, the very nationalism which is central so much to civilization, politics, and needless to say, to war in the 19th century, had one of its epicenters in the phenomena of the World's Fairs, over and over again declared as elements of creating a peaceful world, of commercial cooperation, but also representing national rivalries. What fascinates me is the emergence of a new function for the architectural display in the context of the World's Fair, and that is the question, when I'm invited to the World's Fair from a different country, how do I go? How do I dress? What do I want to send? What am I going to display? What is going to represent, let us say, Hungary in Paris or Russia in London? The 1867 World's Fair, the fourth great World's Fair, was held on the Champ de Mars, as were most of the Parisian World's Fairs in 1867. I'm showing it not only because it's important for me in this incredible organizational machine of how you exhibit things in relationship to one another and begin to take axes of reading. That's a subject in and of itself. But for our purposes, it is all of the national pavilions that filled this picturesque park on the outside of the oval display mechanism. Here is an aerial photograph from the summer of 1867, when this cacophony of historic styles for different countries representing themselves, declaring their identity. As fascinating as declaring your identity by sending yourself abroad, and what do you want to say? This is actually a pavilion created for Japan, because Japan had not participated, but the curators wanted Japan present. Here's the representation, of course, of Egypt. Fascinating here is Russia, and Austria, Sweden's this, Switzerland's this way. If you think I've got it wrong, this is actually Russia, and Sweden. Both of whom returned to vernacular architecture, but also because one of their leading exports was prefabricated timber. So this mixing of kind of national identity and commercial advertisement. But most fascinating for me is what happens when they return home. Many of these were demountable, and they returned home, and they instigated a debate at home on what should our national institutions look like? What should our national architecture look like? So the World's Fairs, for me, and in the point of this chapter, amplify the debate on how national identity should be represented in the permanent architecture of the cityscape. Of course, I couldn't not show you the extent to which France declared its particular relationship to the Islamic world in that fair. A very, very rich subject in this chapter, but it takes us from the World's Fairs to the return to home, from not at home to back at home, not only because some of these pavilions returned home, but one of the visitors to what you're seeing here, the 1878 World's Fair in the shadow of Trocadero, before it was transformed into what we know today, was a man named Arthur Huzelius. And Arthur Huzelius was an ethnographer who was collecting dialects, costumes, and the like throughout his native Sweden. And he was in charge of much to do with the Swedish display, and very taken with what he saw as living people who were often imported to be part, in a very colonialist way, in many of these pavilions. And he came up with the idea that the World's Fair should be taken back home to create the open-air museum. The forerunner, he advised the King of Norway, was King Oscar's buildings here in Oslo, when buildings that were about to be demolished in the countryside were moved to the capital of Norway, that at that time still part of Finland, first in a private collection, but 2 years later opened as the world's first open-air museum, in order to educate urbanites in the authenticity of their rural traditions as they were disappearing. Nothing is more poignant than that, than the grandfather of all open-air museums, and today the Association of Open Museums has thousands and thousands of members worldwide, but generally considered to be really the prototype is Skansen, on an island in the harbor of Stockholm. And what I find particularly poignant there is not only the arrangement of these vernacular rural buildings that have been saved from demolition, and many of them in timber, easily moved and rearranged into pictorial villages on the island, but the contrast with urbanizing Stockholm. So this notion that the world is becoming urban, and then the authentic is to be found in the vernacular, and it's important for school children, for citizens in general, to be able to experience these disappearing traditions. And so the idea of the urban living open-air museum is born out of the architectural dynamics of representation of not at home in the World's Fairs. So Skansen, with some are visitors, some are employed actors, and of course Colonial Williamsburg as a later day 1920s foundation of that. My favorite, the Village Museum in Bucharest, founded by an ethnographer in the 1930s. You can see the map. This section over here was added once the annexation of Transylvania was confirmed. This was Romania, organized geographically. This is the Hungarian annexation. So when Transylvania became part of Romania, Transylvania became part of this museum as well. Now the next chapter, I'm not numbering them so that you won't panic. The next chapter deals with what I'm calling inventing the never-before-seen. So now we're not organizing historical material, but we're trying to use the exhibition to say we can exhibit things that have never before been seen. In a way, they'll be prototypes. This has two sections. You see exhibitions between reform and avant-garde. We'll talk first very briefly about reform. It takes us back to the very first World's Fair, the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in Hyde Park in London, the famous glass and iron building of Joseph Paxton, which is so famous in the history of architecture for its innovations technologically and spatially. But what interests me is an exhibition that was visited by at least as many people, if perhaps not more, since it was free, and that was the model house that was designed by the architect Henri Labrouste, who was part of a movement to create improved dwellings for what were called the laboring classes. This was exhibited across the street next to the Hyde Park Barracks in Knightsbridge, one of the most fashionable neighborhoods of London, receiving suddenly a working class dwelling, because of course by this point we might say the banking and the privileged classes had managed to commute via train into the center of the city, ignoring all the time what Gustave Doré was depicting, the condition of what Engels had already called in 1844 the laboring classes. But Albert became the patron, the financier initially of a society for the improvement of working class dwellings, and this model was put on display out of sight, in plain view, not only for visitors of all classes, including the working class who could go for free on certain days of the week, but also for investors in the creation of the private societies that were to transform the situation of housing in the British capital over the next few decades. This became a leitmotif of World's Fairs. Napoleon III sponsoring many in 1867. Here are some of the model houses. Here are people visiting model houses on the 1867 World's Fair grounds. And it continues as a theme in the history of architecture, but of course also in this chapter on reform and the never before seen. The Bauhaus getting all of its energies together for its 1923 show to display a model house, a reflection on possible prefabrication, although the house was in fact not prefabricated, furnished entirely with work from the student workshops as the students worked on the creation of the dwelling of the future as the great project of the present, but put it on display for both local officials to convince them that their money was not being wasted at the Bauhaus, as raucous as the students were, but also to enter the debate in Weimar Germany on ideal housing. Similarly, Le Corbusier refused a place inside the exhibition, Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in 1925, erected on the edge of the fair, adjacent to the Petit Palais, a one unit from his idea that you see below of the immeuble villa, the villa apartment house, essentially the type of artist studios that you can see nearby on the Rue Campagne Première, or other, modernized and taken into a system of building, but usable as a full-scale model unit, much commented upon, and really one of his first abilities to achieve a full-scale building in the French capital. This continues to this day. We could look at, of course, 1948, the first of the museum houses in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art, wanting to transform American taste as the GIs were getting loans to move to the suburbs, as the family of 2.5 children was boarding trains at Grand Central to occupy a colonial revival house. The Museum of Modern Art thought they might better be housed in Marcel Breuer's Butterfly House, completely furnished to show that even with a remote-controlled television, all would be possible in a future world if you would pay attention to the advanced taste of the curators and the architects they hired at MoMA. And this, in turn, inspired Walt Disney to allow the Monsanto Plastics Company, with many other products, to create a House of the Future at Disneyland in 1957. This turned out to be very problematic because the future kept catching up with the house a little bit too quickly and had often to be updated. It is now exhibited as a historic house at Disneyland. The last element of reform, I would say, are two professions that come out of these exhibitions. One we might call what are called housing or housing experts, very much catalyzed in 1900 by the very brave decision of the United States government to send the New York State Tenement Housing Exhibition that protested the living conditions on the Lower East Side and contrasted a model that we have of living conditions with lots of statistics on one block at Christie Forsyth Street on the Lower East Side, as the model that was displayed next to a model of how you could rebuild it, of which we have no evidence, unfortunately. Other profession that emerges from this is the profession of urban planning. The urban planners gather over and over again at specialty conferences at World's Fairs, but they also begin to imagine ways to, both as a profession, defining itself through these assemblies, but also in a gathering publics to look at and appreciate not only the complexity of the design of a city as opposed to a building in all of its ecosystems and overlapping infrastructures, but also as a way to educate the public about the complexity of cities. The real leader here is the Scottish geographer, ethnographer, visionary Patrick Geddes. This is a building that still exists but has been totally transformed. His observatory tower in Edinburgh, in which he invited visitors to take an elevator or the stairs to the top floor to see a camera which reflected all, in a camera obscura, which reflected all of Edinburgh onto a mirror in that lantern to be demonstrated by a series of docents. And then they came down and understood the shape of Edinburgh, Edinburgh's shape in Scotland, the Scottish language, everything's relationship to Europe, and then to the world, entering out onto the street, having had a kind of series of floors that expanded their understanding of planning as they descended. The great definition of the urban planning profession took place in a mega exhibition in 1910 in Berlin, just as the German capital was debating whether or not to absorb all of its suburbs into Greater Berlin. This took place a year after the exhibition, but the exhibition, you see here the Allgemeine Städtebauausstellung of 1910, filled an entire museum building and included some of the most famous works in all the urbanism textbooks that were brought together for comparison there. Daniel Burnham's rebuilding of Chicago, Hénard's notion of redoing the Haussmannian streets of Paris, that they might incorporate different levels of transportation, trolleys, metro, of course, services. There were 18th century precedents for this, but a notion, even flying machines, kind of forerunners of drones, in a revision of what the Parisian street could look like. And this continues, of course, as well into the post-war period and in the present. One of my favorite stopping points is the Better Philadelphia exhibition, not only because I'm from Philadelphia, but because it had an extraordinary before and after technique, and it did not install itself in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but in the great courtyard of Gimbel's department store on Market Street. And there, this extraordinary exhibition, which had a whole army of demonstrators, but also could flip at a switch so that you could see the existing city folding under a redeveloped. So here are all of the rhetoric of urban redevelopment as the magical future, the critique not yet begun. The second part of this idea of the never-before-seen is the proposition that the avant-garde itself could scarcely exist without the medium of the exhibition. I take as the title slide here, of course, the parading of Tatlin's monument to the Third International in 1920 through the streets of Petrograd, the future St. Petersburg, and then its installation in a gallery display of this proposed radical new defeat of capitalism. The Eiffel Tower is, of course, 300 meters tall. This building was to be 400 meters tall, and it was to be the central government as well as the central propaganda system in the top rotating forms, which were going to be a kind of news outlet form, presumably for information rather than disinformation, as we learned in today's Guardian. What about the futurists? They hardly would exist were it not for various outlets publishing their manifesto on the front page of the Figaro, beginning to stage exhibitions even as they persuaded a young architecture student, Antonio de Sant'Elia, to change his drawing style and imagine a futuristic city so that the futurist movement would also have an architectural component. Or the Dutch De Stijl group, coming together as a group in a sense not only in Amsterdam but being labeled as such when they exported their work to Paris and were put on exhibit in Léon Rosenberg's Galerie Les Forts Modernes as De Stijl. So the naming of groups, the naming of the avant-gardes, the coherence, even the very existence of the avant-gardes, often based entirely on unbuilt projects, made possible by the exhibition. Mies van der Rohe, in fact, even changed his name when he was rejected from one exhibition, changed his style, adopted an avant-garde persona, and began this drawing, which is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, is taller than I am. It was created, in fact, for its exhibition impact and exhibited at the architecture exhibition at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus called together what they considered appropriate examples of modernist architecture from across Europe, even to the United States. Frank Lloyd Wright was included, to define international architecture in 1923. Now, the last thing I want to point out in relationship to this, but this chapter goes, of course, to the neo-avant-gardes as well, is the capacity to project at full scale types of architecture that had never been seen before. Friedrich Kiesler had created an apparatus, an interactive apparatus for exhibiting architectural drawings and materials in Vienna in the early 1920s. But his apparatus, he thought, was so beautiful that he brought it to Paris in 1925 and exhibited only the framework for that as a city in space. So the beginning of the projection of completely new architectonic and spatial ideas made possible now by a fully developed avant-garde culture of architectural display. And it leads us, you'll be here pleased to know, quickly into the final sequence of exhibition chapters of Out of Sight, in Plain View, which take us to the 1920s, by which time I'm claiming the culture of exhibition is now so diverse and so well anchored, and in certain places so well institutionalized, which also makes possible the counter-institution, that we can begin to trace exhibitions talking to other exhibitions. There is a culture of exhibitions in which an exhibition gives rise to its opposition, to its elaboration, to exhibitions speaking to one another with both the full potential and, as I'll argue at the very end, some of the dangers of that. When I first started this project, I was working at the Museum of Modern Art. I had privileged access to the archives. I assumed the project would be a kind of history of MoMA, the oldest sustained department of architecture in the world. Here's the museum photographed shortly after it reopened in its international style building in 1930 with the address on the roof in case Corbusier needed to know where to go as he was landing at LaGuardia Airport. It was the first museum also to have a sidewalk entrance through a revolving door, but that's not really our subject here. Number of exhibitions would take place here. The department would move in. But I assumed that, as had always been told to everyone, the Museum of Modern Art was the leader. It took the role. Each one of its exhibitions was a unique enterprise. As I began to look into the press around the exhibitions, I found that almost to a one, a polemical exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art is responding to other exhibitions and will in turn engender other exhibitions in response. So a year before the very first exhibition, the one that gave us the name The International Style, there was already a dispute between a rejected architect show showing the international style as an opposition display to the annual exhibition of the Architectural League, considered traditional in its display. In fact, those who went to the exhibition of rejected architects, organized by the young impresario Philip Johnson, got an enormous audience because Johnson hired sandwich board men to walk in front of the exhibition at the Architectural League saying, "Don't enter here. Go to the rejected architects several blocks away." So this makes sense of the very first line in the very first architectural publication ever published by the Museum of Modern Art, which we're always told initiated architectural exhibitions with the 1932 so-called International Style Show. And the first line reads, "Expositions and exhibitions have perhaps changed the character of American architecture of the last 40 years more than any other factor." So they're acknowledging a 40-year history as well as the impact and importance of exhibitions. Of course, the reference point back is to the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So the first exhibition of 1932, Modern Architecture International Exhibition, meant to change taste in America, to introduce the work of the Bauhaus in one gallery, the work of Le Corbusier, to identify a supranational style that is the style of the age. The introduction says that the last time there was an international style was when France gave the world International Gothic. Now we have an international style appropriate for the modern industrial age of the post-World War period. So you see where that one's going. Equally in this, what I call conflicting visions, commerce, diplomacy, and persuasion. And now the absolute political implications and the politics of these exhibitions, not simply to change taste from banker colonial to international Corbusian, but actually the stakes of fighting it out, if you will, through architecture. I think you can all guess what's going on here. This is the demonstration of a very large-scale model for the future House of German Art, today the Haus der Kunst in Munich, Hitler's earliest cultural project, being paraded through the streets of Munich by SS members who are dressed up as medieval workmen to deliver this building to the future construction site, where later on there will be numerous Nazi exhibitions of the great architectural wonders of the Reich. It helps us explain and understand what was going on when in the basement of Rockefeller Center, even before it was inaugurated, the Museum of Modern Art, temporarily displaced from its future building site, staged a Bauhaus exhibition in 1938, 5 years after Hitler had closed the Bauhaus, but just a few months after the exhibition of degenerate art in Munich had begun to circulate. So here we are in this world of warring exhibitions. This chapter has many, many examples. It's going to follow it into the diplomacy of the United States State Department after the Second World War, but just one earlier step of that I couldn't resist showing you. Exactly the same year, the New York World's Fair of 1939, where the pavilion of the International Cash Register Company, an extraordinary recreation of architecture parlante, shows off its brand, but it's a working brand because the cash register is recording every paying visitor that enters the fairgrounds. And on the right, the fairgrounds of the People's Permanent Exhibition of Economic Achievements opened in the same year in Moscow. You could still visit today. The last pre-manifesto chapter of the book is called Architecture and the Rise of the Event Economy, from Postmodernism to Starchitecture, 1981, probably to 2020. Here we see the prototype star architect Philip Johnson holding up his postmodern model. This is a model, interestingly enough, that was not made to build the AT&T building, which came to be known overnight as the Chippendale Highboy, but rather a model that was made for this photo shoot, commissioned by Time magazine. And shortly thereafter, Johnson, in fact, was awarded the first Pritzker Prize, interestingly, part of this rise of the event economy around architecture. Why 1981? 1981 is not only the moment, really, of the beginning of the liberal consensus of the Thatcher-Reaganite years, of the rise of the event economy, which will be discussed at length in this chapter. It is also the year of the first architectural biennale held in Venice. The Italians still say it was the first ever architectural biennale. It's completely not true. The Sao Paulo Architectural Biennale in the 1950s was the first, but this is always referred to as the first, but also as the birthplace of a very theatrical, consumerist, postmodern, a new vision of history. Here's the famous Strada Novissima in the Arsenale in Venice, which will once again in a few weeks be given over to the Architectural Biennale. And the rebirth of World's Fairs as great marketing and event cultures. This is my visit, 2010, to the Shanghai World's Fair. This is the China Pavilion. That's the newspaper that I received in the hotel that morning. Expo staff await 1.2 million visitors. That's not over the course of the fair. That was that day. So the notion of these absolutely enormous events, there was the huge debate, should the U.S. go, should the U.S. not go? Just two visions of this. The Dutch were the most brilliant. They did a history of Dutch housing. They realized that a ramp is not only to enjoy time, but is to display time. So they took over the idea of the highways of Shanghai. That's not part of the exhibition. That's the highway exchange a few miles away. This is a fake highway exchange as a building exhibition in which you visited the history of the Dutch house for the Dutch pavilion. So I've overstayed my welcome. I'm just going to show you a 2-second notion of one of my dilemmas, and I look forward to discussing this with my fellow fellows tomorrow. I'm both a historian and a curator, so far I've been acting as historian in this entire presentation, but I have also been now for many years also a curator, and I have my own ideas about exhibiting and what to do. And so the final epilogue is actually a bit about my own activities, and I call it the return of public debate. We go full circle back to the 18th century, the case for the activist exhibition. And there I talk about an exhibition which I'll talk about at much greater length in a few weeks at the École Spéciale, which was the first of a series of exhibitions that I undertook at the Museum of Modern Art to put central issues that I think confront the architectural profession today, but also public officials, public at large, on display. Most importantly here, climate change, the only one I'll show you. The inspiration was my great heroine, the young curator, Hauser, historian, activist, Catherine Bauer, who in her late 20s published this book still regarded today as a definitive introduction to the problem of modern housing. There you see her. At the same time, she was involved in creating this, the housing exhibition of the city of New York, in which she not only orchestrated a great deal of information into digestible form, she shocked the public by bringing one full room from a tenement being demolished on the east side, installing it in all of its squalor, including cockroaches, in the Museum of Modern Art, and then in the exact same square footage showed how you could create a more proper living environment. So there's an existing tenement apartment and on the same scale. Of course, I had a copy of the Museum of Modern Art's recent publications on architecture, which every family would need in their minimum dwelling. She also put on display projects for reforming. This is the exact same site that had been exhibited at the 1900 World's Fair on Christie Street with a project for reforming it, and inviting public officials to come to the museum to debate it and to try to encourage them to finance it. And then on the way out, she had a room, kind of relational aesthetics, where you could sit down with an advisor and discuss the banking system in the United States, 1934, in the middle of the Depression, and in a sense have a discussion about mortgage with a hired curator activist. This was my inspiration for an exhibition I did now over a decade ago on the challenge that New York City, like so many cities, is facing with rising sea levels. This was called Rising Currents. Again, you need to think about my love for plays on words. Rising currents, because of course the water is rising. But this was initiated in 2008 in the middle of the last financial crisis, when suddenly many young architects were out of work. We raised money through the Rockefeller Foundation, and I put them in residence, this is another residency, at PS1, which was closing some of its galleries because it didn't have enough money to run them all. And they sat for 8 weeks and imagined how to remodel New York to deal with all of these zones up through yellow, which are likely to disappear underwater, either in a high storm or with rising sea levels in a matter of decades. We divided the city harbor into 5 zones, and we got 5 interdisciplinary teams to work, and we began to invite the public to come in and see the work in progress in the workshop galleries of MoMA PS1. Even before the show opened, the press, this is New York Magazine, was debating it. Here's PS1 where it took place. Here are private debates on the evolving projects and open house days in which the public came in and discussed the projects underway with the designers, saw architecture as a process of thinking, not as simply an arrogant object to be exhibited once finalized. And then at the 10th week, we moved all of the objects to the Museum of Modern Art for display, including, and I'll only mention 2, this one, which wants to surround Lower Manhattan with an absorptive green zone that can be ready when the next great hurricane, like Sandy, by the way, took place 2 years after this image was made, flooding Lower Manhattan, kind of the return to what's called the Manhattan Project, to return Manhattan back to what it was when the Native Americans understood what the ecology was like, rethinking the streets as absorption. And then the last one I'll show you, this project for the Gowanus Canal, one of the dirtiest places in the water anywhere in North America, where the brilliant landscape architect Kate Orff and her team imagined transforming the shallow waters of the Buttermilk Channel between Brooklyn and Governor's Island and the Gowanus Canal into the world's largest oyster hatchery. Why? Because oysters clean many times their body weight in water every day. They're actually an anti-pollutant mechanism, but they also are extremely social animals, and unlike the fellows here in the Institute who stay often in their own offices, oysters glue themselves to one another from a very early age, and they create reefs which will break storm thrust and storm surge as it comes into New York Harbor. Here, the oysters are going to be developed, they're going to be moved out, and they're going to become a public park to break storm surge when it's racing towards Manhattan, and a natural if you will, natural environmental approach to rethinking not simply the cityscape, but the bathymetry of the New York Harbor. She's even hopeful that eventually the Gowanus Canal, and I'll end with this because I know many of you are hungry, will become a branch of the Grand Central Oyster Bar with these really rehabilitated oysters. So that is a little bit of a taster, if you will, of my idea of the activist exhibition, the exhibition that takes an issue of vital importance, entrusts it to designers, and uses their proposals to incite public debate and public thinking about topics of actually vital importance. And I'll just conclude by saying that 2 years after this event, when Hurricane Sandy flooded Manhattan, I was invited to the Mayor's Office of Emergency Preparedness to discuss this exhibition with them. I told them I'm not a technician, I don't have the answers, but I'm really glad that the exhibition is remembered by you 2 years later as a catalyst for getting on with what really needs to be thought about and debated. Thank you for your attention to my rather exhaustive survey of these 10 chapters of this book.
Yes, thank you very much. It was excellent. Seeing the photo of Mitterrand brought to mind the new entrance to the Louvre. And to me, he had a conversation with I.M. Pei that was the model. And he said something I found very extraordinary. He said, what happened to Bernini will not happen to you. That is, Bernini's was rejected. This will be accepted. I don't know if he had final say on that, or if it was entirely his say, or if it was consultative. But in general, has there been a case when the public's opinion has been consulted, and if it has been respected in any major work of architecture?
Yeah, that's a tough one because I would say there are probably many more cases where public opinion has moved a decision away from something, not necessarily right to the. So the World Trade Center is a real a case where the demand for the public debate and the opening up of the public debate, there was a counter exhibition. All of that led to a complete change of the project, but it didn't mean that the public in the end was that had voted. There was actually a voting box in that, but it was in part symbolic. But it did break the idea that the decision would be taken behind closed doors. So I think there are many more examples of forcing the debate into wider channels than there are necessarily of the public by some kind of referendum choosing something. You know, I think in the end, what I was hoping to show you here is I was trying to engage the public debate in the issue as a whole, rather than necessarily get an endorsement for one project or another. Moreover, these were ideas that were meant to incite discussion rather than blueprints for something that you could actually do. So that's a real evasion of your question. I don't have the smoking gun for the one time it happened, but I might find it.
Thank you, Barry. This was a real whirlwind, and I'm a complete novice to this to this line of thinking and work. One of the things, though, that I was trying to see repeated, try to follow through your presentation, was the idea of the public and the public in the private space, and the involvement of the public in different types of projects. So, if I understood you correctly, at some point, public projects were opened up to the public. But what about private projects? I mean, in some of the exhibitions later, you show that there are private houses or there are workers' houses. But when I think about New York and all these silly skyscrapers that are coming up, I don't think we have a public debate about them at all. So is that part of the consumer culture? Is this part of capitalism that, where you have basically one part, and actually most of the buildings that are being built are not public buildings? So where's the public in the private architecture?
Yeah. I think that's a very provocative question. I mean, there needs to be much greater fine-tuning throughout of the very concept of the public as one moves through. But the last chapter that I glossed over in about 30 seconds is already a critique of what I fear has become an architectural exhibition culture as carnival, in which, as a kind of, hence the event economy notion that there's a complete distraction into a circus of large-scale events, biennials, fairs, trade shows, and the like, and that in a certain sense the public interest has often retreated. And that's, in a sense, how I hope that this articulation of an attempt to bring the key issues back into the public in the call for an activist exhibition, that's what the dynamic is. I do completely agree with you that, particularly, but not only, in the neoliberal economy in which we've now all lived for decades, the examination of private interests, even when they totally compromise the public. You're thinking of the super talls in New York, which is indeed, anything that can be, particularly in New York, but in other places as well, anything that can be construed as legally possible is therefore as of right, and therefore not subject to public discussion. So that's a phenomena that goes far beyond the issue of the architectural exhibition, but yeah.
Thank you, Barry. That was really fantastic. So I was struck by the use of painting as the first medium for exhibiting architecture. It seems like not the most obvious one. Clay or sculpture or some kind of 3D rendering would seem to be the more obvious. And then I was also struck by when 3D renderings finally make an appearance that cork was the medium used. Again, not the most obvious choice. I mean, at least the cork I'm familiar with disintegrates, and it's very hard to manipulate. So could you comment on the slowness of 3D models to make an appearance in this history that you're tracing, and also why you think painting was the, rather than drawing, for example, was the initial medium?
Well, it's the risk of getting a little bit into the weeds. We do know, for instance, Charles de Vailly, who is probably the forerunner of a concept I didn't talk about tonight, but what we might call the exhibition architect, just people whose careers are absolutely dependent on an ecology of display. I'm modeling this on a very influential book on artists called The Exhibition Artist, that was written by a Swiss historian named Oscar Bachmann, about the fact that by the 19th century, art is produced to go directly into the museum, so that the museum actually, rather than gathering art, actually begins to become the place for which art is created. So I'm taking that over with the concept of the exhibitionist or the exhibition architect, and probably de Vailly is a forerunner of that. That was all a prelude to saying that he actually exhibited very early on, 1769, I think, a model of a staircase that he thought was particularly ingenious for a project that he was building outside of Dijon called the Château de Montmoussat. So in that case, there is an example of using an architectural model. There is no image of that model to know if the model was the type of technical model that might be used to work with the people who were going to build this staircase, presumably of stone, or if it, like some of his architectural renderings, had already entered a more legible, popular mode. So it's showing you architectural drawings becoming very much assimilating towards painting styles in the 18th century, so that those aren't necessarily the types of drawings that would be made in the architectural workshop, or for the architect to actually design or figure out the nature of the project. So there it seems that there were some architectural models on display in the French Salon from the moment that architects found a way to display there. On the other hand, I have many, many examples in the late 18th century where models are exhibited in a different section of the exhibition from drawings and paintings of the exact same project. For instance, an extremely important project in Berlin in the 1790s was the New Mint, which also housed the School of Architecture on its upper floor, and was exhibited numerous times in public exhibitions in the 1790s. But in one in particular, the drawings were exhibited in the fine arts section of the exhibition, and the models were exhibited in the mechanical arts section of the exhibition because they had been made by a carpenter, and therefore they were considered manual arts. So I think, too, the preference in the salon for pictorial representation is part of moving architecture into the realm of the perception of art as opposed to his perception of the mechanical or the craft. There was another part to your question, Elise?
No, that was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that thrilling presentation. As usual, it's just so radically synthetic that it leaves so many things stitched together and so many things provocatively unstitched. So thank you. To revisit your question of in and out of time, I'm wondering what you make a little bit of the relationship between the temporary and the permanent in this story, because you would think that a temporary installation, as you demonstrate, sometimes allows a lot of creative courage or a certain avant-garde expression, but at the same time, you think of the White City and the permanence of plaster and the kind of retrograde influence of that, and then in expositions, things that are ostensibly temporary that become permanent, or ostensibly permanent that become temporary. I think there's a prominent tower somewhere in this city that I think, at least apocryphally, was supposed to be temporary, but has lasted so far. So I just wonder what you make of that slippage in time as another kind of decontextualization and recontextualization.
So, could I take your question to mean that the temporary exhibition gives greater freedom for being experimental or hypothetical or provisional, and that one feels a bigger weight of responsibility for installing a permanent collection?
I'm just curious about the relationship between the temporary and the permanent, of things that surprisingly endure, and then things that are extraordinarily significant for a moment and then vanish until someone doing your good work retrieves them and restores them to discourse.
Well, of course, it's often said, and this is an old line, but I think not one to be disputed, that the World's Fairs architectures, particularly in the 19th century, were extraordinarily experimental because they didn't have to go through the same approval process. They weren't going to be permanent. Yeah, and indeed, as you evoked, the Eiffel Tower was not meant to be a permanent structure. Eiffel and it's extraordinary how few people today realize that it's a monument to the centennial of the French Revolution. Everybody thinks it's a monument to Eiffel's genius, so it also manages by its permanence to change meaning. But even those things that are permanent, as you say, synthetic with a lot of loose threads, so it's like a sweater that might fall apart if you pull it too firmly over your head. Even permanent galleries of things are constantly under change, although something like Louis Casas's gallery, he thought that he was consolidating a vision of history that would hold. The place only existed for a very short time, so we don't know if it would have been arranged subsequently. But if you take the Musée de la Sculpture Comparée, you could look at the various iterations at the Trocadero, how different generations of people working there, of curators, have used the same objects to create different versions, or sometimes even conflicting versions of a story. I lived through 10 years at the Museum of Modern Art, where the non-stop meeting subject was, can we redisplay the collection to completely change the story that this museum is responsible for having created in the first place? So even the permanent is rarely permanent, although it's often at the time that it's set up has the aspirations to consolidate some vision of the evolution of time, of what matters and what doesn't matter, and most particularly what you can get from the shape of all of the things brought together rather than from the contemplation of any individual object.
Thank you, Barry, so much for your rich lecture. I had a question that's related to your answer to Katerina's question earlier. I was also interested in tracking the public in your talk. And in the earlier part of the earlier chapters you describe, it seems that you kind of describe an opening up of an elite space to include public reactions. But then there's a kind of and this is where I'm not sure I'm imagining or not, but there seems to be a kind of shift, especially arriving at the moment when with MoMA, exhibitions are speaking to exhibitions. So they are open to the public. I mean, there's a difference, generally with regard to the past, but can you talk maybe more about maybe what the public is at that point? Because it seems like a very different, it's different from the monumentality, the actual open spaces that you could walk through. Now these are spaces that are engaged in a conversation within a field, and often, as in MoMA, behind a paywall. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about what the public is after that moment, moving forward into the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Well, the public, that directly connects to Katerina's question, which is, in a certain sense, I think a call to pay attention to the changing notions of what the public is, and both explicitly what it is and implicitly what it is. So, of course, there's actually a wonderful book by a old friend of mine who wrote a doctoral dissertation and then a book on 19th century provincial museums in France called Worthy Monuments. And one of the things that he studies in there are the unwritten codes about who is actually admitted to these museums, which have to do with checking your umbrella, the way you dress, all sorts of things that really define some notion of who constitutes the public. So, I am aware that I'm throwing that a word around tonight as though it's how we all understand that the public is a changing, restricted category. Although I would say, in response to you citing specifically the chapter on exhibitions referring to other exhibitions, I don't mean to imply there that somehow at that point the public is no longer of concern, that these exhibitions are talking to one another without regard to the public that's coming in that in a certain way is a sort of escalation of the public debate, and that the spillover of all of this into the realm of the press, and then by the time of the invention of MoMA into not simply the written press but the television press, to the radio and the television press, MoMA produced an awful lot of material to go on to the radio, for instance. So I don't think the public is falling away because the exhibitions are speaking to one another. On the contrary, MoMA is you might say that MoMA is interested in multiple publics. Does it imagine that the future inhabitants of the public housing that it is advocating for are going to be coming rushing into the gallery? Probably not its primary concern. Its primary concern in those early exhibitions, as in ironically many exhibitions about housing, is not targeted for the residents of the housing. It's targeted for investors and for the people who are the whole system of housing, in fact. So Prince Albert's house, already in 1852, is largely involved in trying to convince people to become investors and financiers in the various philanthropic societies that are the prototypes for what will become European societies in the coming decades. And likewise, the MoMA exhibition in 1934, which in part leads to elements in the Federal Housing Code of 1937, is as much addressed to public administration as it is to, there's no imagination that people are going to take the F train from the Lower East Side and see these projects and debate them and say whether that's the way they want to live. That's the public here is a public of decision makers, undoubtedly expanded from the 18th century, but this is not, to quote your favorite line from a movie, this is not tout le monde. This is a different concepts of the public. Does that help at all?
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Barry, thank you very much. That was really very rich, provocative. I can't wait for reading you. I would like to go back to the question asked before, somewhere over there on permanent and temporary. You touched upon this matter in several points of your presentation. I was wondering if you are going to address in a specific or less specific way the relationship between the exhibits and the building containing them, because you made certain links between that, but I was not sure if you're going to be a little bit more willing to work on that, or it was only by chance that you addressed that.
Could you give me a concrete example of help me understand what you mean by the buildings that they contain? I mean, it is quite specifically not going to be a history of architecture. It's a history
Yes,
of
well,
architecture exhibitions.
I was thinking in terms of architecture parlante, in terms of the symbol of the building containing the exhibits. Well, even going back to the Exposition Universelle, thinking of the fact that the pavilions themselves were containers for other exhibits, so on and so forth. Or thinking about how the MoMA Museum had this kind of caption on its roof saying, "This is the MoMA Museum," in the way perhaps the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève had all the lettering on the facade when Labrouste thought about how to project the facade of the library.
So admittedly, I mean, I would underscore it's not a history of architecture. It's not a history of the museum building. There are many histories of the museum as a building type, but the lines are blurred at certain points. So I am interested in moments that are, you might say, blurred, ambiguous. The World's Fair in particular is one, because of course the pavilions themselves were only one of the many manifestations of architectural displays that took place. If you're interested in the history of photography, some of the earliest exhibitions of architecture uniquely through the medium of photography were staged in World's Fairs. Cities had exhibitions about themselves, not just nations, etc. So the World's Fairs are such extraordinary machines for all of the techniques of exhibiting anything, but of exhibiting architecture as well. So I am as interested in the exhibitions of architectural representations in the fairs as I am in the pavilions. And I'm mostly interested in the pavilions as the prehistory for the invention of the open air museum. So that's what but yes, I mean, one of the real problems of this project is that it is so vast. So the organizing principle is not to create a universal survey museum. The principle is that each chapter makes a hypothesis of something made possible by exhibiting architecture that is not readily made possible by the practice of architecture in and of itself. So the creation of public debate, the creation of a historical chronology, so each one of those is about some dynamic that comes out of this out of sight, in plain view, decontextualization, recontextualization. So the thing that tries to keep this project under control is keeping that dynamic as the central hypothesis and then conjugating it in each of these different situations, which temporally is moving forward because the first instance of each possibility is later in time on each occasion. So that the chapters are kind of doing this. Each one steps backwards over the material of the last one because the origin point has already been surpassed in suggesting that the dynamic, as I did in the first example, that the dynamic goes up to at least the World Trade Center debates and beyond, but then the next chapter takes us back to organizing history, takes us back to the late 18th century and goes forward again. So hopefully that also allows me to realize that I can't, can't just be, it has to be a curated museum. It just can't be a book in which every possible thing I think of that's related to architecture and display comes into it.
That was great, Barry. I have one question related to my special interest, which is, at what point does night representation of a building come into play? I can think of Hugh Ferris's drawings in the 30s.
Yeah.
And some of the earliest night photography was of Buffalo, World's Fair, and so on. So, and Zola took pictures also of exhibitions at night here in Paris. So does that become a feature sometime around the 1910s, 20s?
Well, there's electricity in World's Fairs already from right on either side of 1900. So the fact that they're open, well, they're even before electricity, the fact that they're open at night was often, and that they served alcohol late at night, was often a great part of their appeal. I have a version of the introduction to this book that spends a great deal of time positing different forms of display and then saying this is not the subject of the book, and I keep tearing them out and saying I don't need to go through all these exclusions. And one of them actually has very much to do with the nighttime sky and the fact that cities beginning in the 20th century begin to curate themselves by deciding what gets lit up and what doesn't, so that the city at night is exhibiting a set of buildings. But this also has forerunners in cartography, particularly cartography that's created for tourists, often coming to the World's Fair. You have the emergence of the version of the map that you still get at Charles de Gaulle Airport that tells you where all the important monuments are, including the Samaritain or the Printemps, whoever pays for the map. And all of the rest are just street lines. So the idea that, which is, of course, enacted by Haussmann, but this cartographic notion, which goes back to pilgrimage maps, that the idea that you select, you curate a set of objects from an urban representation. So I see very much the history of urban illumination as being a little bit that way. I've thought about your question at an early stage. Even the nighttime effects that are sometimes used in models of cities that are part of exhibitions where you have city models on display. I put it in the not for this book category. So maybe tomorrow you can tell me if that's wrong.